National News Now.
Okay, so let's start with some basics of the story. And the big question is, what is the current status of the deal, and what are the parameters of this deal that we're going to be talking about? And we're going to start this section with a clip from ABC News that kind of provides a summary of where we are now. So let's run that clip.
Out of the U.S. border with Mexico. For months, Republicans have been pushing President Biden, arguing if you want funding for Ukraine and Israel, the U.S. must act at the U.S. border. Now, a bipartisan group of senators, Democrats and Republicans, say they're close to a deal for the first time in many years. President Biden says he'll support it. But now Republicans, led by Donald Trump, say they don't want a deal after all. Of course, the race for the White House is here. So is Mary Bruce.
For months, Republicans have demanded a crackdown on illegal immigration. And tonight, President Biden says he'll give it to them, promising to shut down the border if Congress passes the bipartisan immigration deal on the table.
If that bill were the law today, I'd shut down the border right now and fix it quickly.
But Donald Trump, eager to make immigration a key issue in a likely rematch with Biden, is stepping up his pressure on Republicans to kill the compromise.
As the leader of our party, there is zero chance I will support this horrible open borders betrayal of America.
Even though Republicans have long been pushing for tough border legislation, today Trump posting on social media a border bill is not necessary. Listen to what the Republican senator leading the talks is now saying, angry at the thought his colleagues are ready to give up on something that had been their top priority.
Republicans 4 months ago would not give funding for Ukraine, for Israel, and for our southern border because we demanded changes in policy. So we actually locked arms together and said, we're not going to give you money for this. We want a change in law. And now it's interesting, a few months later, when we're finally getting to the end, they're like, oh, just kidding. I actually don't want a change in law because it's a presidential election year.
Some Republicans, they're clearly exasperated that Trump is trying to derail his own party's top priority, but others are following his lead. House Speaker Mike Johnson says any Senate compromise would be dead on arrival in the House. Instead, House Republicans are focused on impeaching Biden's Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas.
Okay, let me just say a few things that sort of give the broader narrative of how this story is unfolding, right? And so, first of all, this deal that we're going to be talking about at length is a product of a long bipartisan negotiation, months long, right? It's between a team of senators, a small team. There was ultimately three main ones that negotiated with the Biden administration to try to construct a deal that would include both Ukraine aid and policy changes at the border. The Biden administration in this negotiation, and this is going to be a key point that we're going to be returning to regularly, ultimately provided significant concessions in the final deal, and the final product here is a largely strong and restrictive deal that will enact a lot of policies that Biden has never endorsed before, Democrats have tended to resist in the past, and also does not include the regular demands of some sort of compromise position where if you increase border security, you're also going to provide some accommodation for undocumented groups within the already here in the United States, particularly Dreamers who were brought in as children and didn't really have full say in whether they would come into the United States illegally or not. All of those sort of accommodations that Democrats typically push and try to get into this deal are not there. It's just the border security thing. And so this is a risk for Biden, I would say, not particularly with parts of his own party within the Democratic Party here. Progressives aren't very enthusiastic about this deal. They haven't criticized it very loudly because, in part, it's the president's plan, but also because the other half of the deal, right, the aid to Ukraine, is so important for this administration and for the Democratic Party in general. Now, you have all that, a relatively conservative bill that should satisfy or at least attract some Republican support, but, and that's where we're going to really be digging into this, presidential politics seems to have intervened here at the very end once the deal has been put together, and calculations regarding the electoral ramifications of this deal, if it became law, have triggered Donald Trump to signal his opposition to the deal, arguably, and also Republican supporters of Donald Trump. And so we're going to talk about all of those things.
So let's, now that we kind of have a general overview surrounding the deal, let's get into some of the specifics of the deal itself. And we're going to start this section with a clip from Face the Nation. So go ahead and roll that clip now.
President Biden has vowed that he will shut down the U.S.-Mexico border when it becomes overwhelmed, if Congress approves a bipartisan proposal under negotiation in the Senate. This weekend, those lawmakers have been finalizing details of the deal. If approved, it would require Homeland Security to reject migrants after average daily border crossings surpass 5,000 over 7 days. It would raise the standard to accept asylum seekers and shorten the time for legal review of their cases to just 6 months, expand fast-track deportations, and restrict the use of the Immigration Parole Authority. The deal also includes measures related to legal migration. It'll allocate 50,000 more immigrant visas, give status to the children of skilled workers, and offer permanent residency to Afghans brought here after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. All this on top of the $14 billion President Biden has previously requested to fund operations and hire additional personnel. For more, CBS's Camilo Montoya Galvez is at the border in Eagle Pass, Texas. So, Camilo, what would the immediate impact be?
Good morning, Margaret. The immigration compromise being negotiated by President Biden and a small group of senators in Congress would dramatically change policy here at the U.S.-Mexico border. The president would gain a sweeping authority to effectively shut down asylum processing when there's a spike in daily illegal crossings. Right now, an average of 4,000 migrants are crossing the border each day. That means that if this deal was to be signed today, Margaret, the president would almost certainly be able to invoke this power immediately, giving border agents here the authority to quickly return migrants to Mexico. Importantly, this deal includes humanitarian exceptions and would preserve asylum processing at official ports of entries. Migrants would also be able to work immediately in the U.S. if they pass their initial asylum screenings. Margaret, this deal will certainly garner opposition from the left and the right. But if Congress is able to pass this framework, it would mark the first time that the U.S. immigration system is updated since the 1990s.
So the first thing to note about this deal is that it's much more favorable to conservative interests than we think either side expected. And more importantly, it provides more to conservatives than all prior proposals in past attempts to reach a compromise on this issue. For example, since the Obama administration, all previous attempts at bipartisan immigration reform included some type of accommodation, usually a path to citizenship for dreamers, who are those undocumented persons who were children when they entered the United States and were granted special protections by an executive order of President Obama. In prior deals, Democrats have always insisted on protections for dreamers in exchange for increased security measures at the border. In this deal, no such trade or bargain between Democratic and Republican demands was struck. So what are some core elements of the deal? First, as the president claimed in a campaign speech, the plan provides the president with new emergency powers to shut down the border when it becomes overwhelmed. If entries passed 5,000 per day, the use of expulsion authority would become mandatory. Those with knowledge of the position claim the sweeping authority would be comparable to the COVID-era Title 42 policy put in place under President Trump during the pandemic. Title 42 provided broad powers to turn back those people who were trying to enter the United States and had crossed the border illegally. However, migrants trying to claim asylum would still be able to do so at legal border crossings if the expulsion power was in effect. The plan would allow up to 1,400 entries per day to approach at the legal border crossing. Second, the plan raises the standard for claiming asylum, making it more difficult for individuals to claim the protections associated with asylum. It also shortens the time to resolve asylum cases to 6 months, so that individuals seeking asylum are not allowed to stay in the United States for years waiting for their asylum case to be heard. Third, the plan expands expedited deportations. The idea being discussed is an expansion of a program already in place to track migrant families. This program places ankle bracelets to track the heads of a household and imposes a curfew for all family members until their court hearings. If they are determined not to qualify for asylum, they are then prioritized for fast deportation under the program. Finally, the plan restricts the use of humanitarian parole for migrants. Humanitarian parole is a long-standing policy in which the United States government can let people into the country by bypassing the regular immigration processes. This power has been used on a case-by-case basis for, quote, urgent humanitarian reasons or, quote, significant public benefit for people from target countries like Hungary in the 1950s, Vietnam in the 1970s, or Iraqi Kurds with the United States, who worked with the United States during the conflicts in Iraq. Migrants are usually admitted for a predetermined period with no path to citizenship. This process would now be significantly curtailed.
And it should be noted here that process is so controversial because very recently, President Biden has used that process in a very large-scale way where 300,000 or more migrants have been legally allowed into the United States through this humanitarian parole. And, Republicans and conservatives are saying that this is just a kind of back-channel way to skirt controls that they're trying to put in place. Okay, so now we know the basic contours of the plan to link immigration reform and aid to Ukraine. And so we want to take a step back and provide some background on how we got to this point. And we want to start with some background on the war between Russia and Ukraine that has been going on since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So this is nearly a 2-year-long war. And we first want to explore here in this background on the war, the reasons why Russia and Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, wanted to risk an all-out invasion of Ukraine. And the first thing I'll say is that this was a war of choice for Russia. There was no imminent threat of aggression from Ukraine toward Russia, or even a crisis that threatened to significantly change the international status of Ukraine. Ukraine was not about to formally join NATO, for example, or the European Union, or anything like that. Rather, Putin had long-term goals for greater control over Ukraine's foreign policy and ultimately Ukraine's domestic politics, and he decided to pursue those goals with military force, and he decided to do it in February 2022. Now, the reasons, the goals that Vladimir Putin wanted to achieve can be grouped, I would argue, in 3 intersecting categories that represent increasingly deeper levels of Russian control over Ukraine. So first, Putin took military action against Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Putin has long seen the expansion of NATO after the end of the Cold War is threatening to Russia's national security interests. He not only wants assurances that Ukraine will not join NATO right now, which he has gotten, right, from the West, or while he is in power, but anytime in the future. And threatening to use force to prevent it is a way to, was his way to try to get these sort of guarantees. But in the future, when the balance of power could change and Russia might have less leverage to stop that move of Ukraine into NATO, that's where Putin wanted to get a resolution now to prevent something that could possibly happen in the future and in even the long-term future. And so a successful military invasion, from Putin's perspective, that installed a pro-Russian government in Ukraine would have provided that permanent solution. So that's his first goal. Secondly, Putin also believes a Western-oriented Ukraine that is economically and culturally tied to the West is a threat, even if it's not formally part of NATO. And so Putin wants to reestablish then Russia's sphere of influence over Ukraine by guaranteeing that Ukraine and its government would be subservient to Russian security and economic interests. And the model, I would say, that he's sort of thinking about would be the neighboring country of Belarus, which is led by a longtime dictator that more or less takes his orders from Russia. And so he wants that kind of control over Ukraine. And then finally, Putin has also argued that Ukraine is an artificial country and that Russians and Ukrainians share a common historical, ethnic, and even spiritual identity. And so he wants, in his words, to reunite the Russian and Ukrainian peoples by recreating a greater Russia that includes Ukraine. And this ethnic appeal also argues that ethnic Russians, which form a large minority in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, face discrimination and need protection from the Russian state. And so those three intersecting goals.
So now we want to briefly discuss why the United States and the West has been supporting Ukraine. It was not a foregone conclusion that the United States and its Western allies would remain united and provide sufficient economic and military support for Ukraine throughout the duration of the conflict up until this point. Many experts expected Western countries to react with strongly worded denunciations of Russian actions, but little else. After all, Russia's 2014 military intervention in Ukraine and its annexation of Crimea produced economic sanctions from the West, but not much else. However, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine seemed to cross a red line that prompted a much stronger Western response. The Biden administration managed to lead a coalition of Western states that imposed some of the strongest economic sanctions ever on a major country, and more importantly, directed substantial amounts of military aid to Ukraine that allowed it to defend itself against the much larger Russian military. So what do the U.S. and its Western allies see as its vital interests, see as their vital interests in this war between Russia and Ukraine? Well, like Russia, the Western alliance supporting Ukraine have had a series of intersecting goals that represent both narrow short-term goals and longer-term broader ambitions. First, for the U.S. and Europe, Ukraine represents the front line of containment against Russian aggression toward its neighbors. Putin not only wants to prevent NATO from expanding and admitting Ukraine, but he has also called for a rollback of NATO's military structures in other parts of Eastern Europe. Newer members of NATO, such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, who were part of the Soviet Union until 1991, are particularly vulnerable to this broader Russian program or goal of the rollback of NATO, and they're vulnerable to Russian military aggression as a result. Western governments feared that a successful Russian invasion of Ukraine could lead to future military interventions in other parts of Eastern Europe. A failure of NATO remaining united to help defend Ukraine with military aid could then signal weakness on the part of NATO members and their unwillingness to defend their members with military force if threatened by Russia. Second, the Biden administration has also framed the conflict over Ukraine in broader moral terms linked to the protection of international norms. The United States needed to defend Ukraine, a fledgling new democracy, from aggression by an authoritarian Russia. Moreover, the post-Cold War security arrangement in Europe is based on the international norm that's designed to protect national sovereignty. And the United States could not allow Russia to change borders unilaterally and wipe out sovereign countries like Ukraine with military force. Third, the fight over Ukraine was meant to send a signal to other authoritarian countries, namely China, who have their own designs on neighboring countries. China views neighboring Taiwan as a renegade Chinese province that needs to be reunited with the mainland. A successful Russian invasion of Ukraine that prompted little Western resistance could have sent a signal to China that it could invade Taiwan and suffer few repercussions from other countries in the world, specifically those countries associated with NATO. Other authoritarian countries might also conclude that the United States and the West were not willing to defend the international order that they themselves had created.
Okay, so finally, I want to speak briefly about why this particular conflict is so important and why you should care about it. Now, I would argue that the war in Ukraine is a historical inflection point. It's important historically. It is more than a regional conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's a conflict that has ramifications for the whole international political system. And as such, how the conflict is resolved will have important consequences for U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic policy, for that matter. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has threatened the post-1991 international settlement. And if Russia is ultimately successful, that settlement following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War will be fundamentally changed, and a U.S.-led European security order will be severely undermined. This is, in my opinion. The war in Ukraine is also a test of strength and solidarity of the West. And so up to now, the West has performed relatively well and consequently has come away stronger, again, up to now. NATO is more united and even larger than ever, having added Finland and Sweden. The conflict has now become a stalemate, however, with neither side able to make significant territorial gains. But even under these conditions, where perhaps Ukraine can't recapture all of the territory it lost from Russian aggression, U.S. interests have been served by preserving Ukraine's independence against a much larger and stronger Russian military. Now, of course, the war is not over, and it's unlikely to be over in any time in the very near future. And so things can change. And the advantages that the West has achieved so far in halting Russian aggression against Ukraine and in arguably deterring future Russian aggression against other European countries or even other authoritarian regimes thinking about threatening their neighbors, all of those achievements could be reversed if Russia becomes ultimately successful in subduing Ukraine. That outcome is much more likely now than it was even, a few months ago, because the United States may end their military aid to Ukraine. And finally, let me just note that aid to Ukraine has had domestic consequences within the United States. It is one of the most important and divisive foreign policy issues in the U.S. The Biden administration sees its handling of this war as one of its biggest foreign policy successes. For much of the war, there were large majorities of Americans who opposed large-scale, supported, not opposed, That's changed. That's who supported large-scale American military aid to Ukraine. However, that large-scale support is starting to change. Overall, public support for aid to Ukraine was initially extremely high, but has declined over time. In the initial months of the conflict, Americans supported Ukraine's war effort and U.S. aid to Ukraine. As the figure in the slide shows, 74% of Americans said that the U.S. either was not providing enough aid to Ukraine or was providing the right amount. 74% of a huge majority. Only 7% said that the U.S. was providing too much aid to Ukraine, signaling that they wanted to limit or end that aid. However, after nearly 2 years of war, American public opinion has changed substantially regarding aid to Ukraine. Now, just under half of respondents, 47%, say that the U.S. is providing either not enough or the right amount of aid, right? So that's support for continuing aid to Ukraine. That's down 26%. Conversely, those who say that the U.S. provides too much aid, thus signaling that they want to limit it or even end it, has risen 24% from 7% back in March 2022 to 31% in the latest surveys. Now, just to be clear, according to the surveys, there are still more Americans who want to continue aid to Ukraine than those who do not. However, the trends are running against further aid. Now, this is also significant, these opinion polls, because they show a large partisan divide regarding support for Ukrainian aid. Although they were originally enthusiastic supporters of Ukraine, Republicans are now substantially more skeptical of U.S. aid and want to limit or end it. So now close to half of Republicans, 48%, think that the United States is providing too much aid to Ukraine. This shift in public opinion among Republican voters or Republican respondents to surveys at least, helps to explain why many Republican members of Congress have started to oppose aid to Ukraine. Democrats, on the other hand, have been more consistently in favor of aid throughout the war, and this helps to explain the Biden administration, but also the broad support of Democratic members of Congress for continuing U.S. aid to Ukraine.
So now that we have some background on the Russia-Ukraine war, let's talk briefly on how we ended up with a legislative plan to combine aid to Ukraine with the divisive issue of immigration reform. So how did these two unrelated issues get linked together in a single legislative plan? And so let's start with the simple timeline. Arguably, President Biden himself linked aid to Ukraine and immigration reform when he included money for border security in his request for aid to Ukraine in October of 2023. At the time, aides to President Biden described this move as a sweetener intended to both address crisis and win over support from Republicans for Ukraine aid. However, some commentators argued that this was a strategic mistake because it opened the door to a connection between aid to Ukraine and immigration that could, and quickly was, used as leverage by Republicans who resisted additional aid to Ukraine. In a sense, it put President Biden in a box by forcing him to deliver some relief to the border crisis in order to get the Republican support needed to pass a bill with aid to Ukraine. Next, Republicans intensified the connection between these two issues by raising the bar on the level of border security necessary to win their support for aid to Ukraine. Republicans are not satisfied with simply additional funding for border security proposed by President Biden. Instead, conservative Republicans demanded not just money, but dramatic policy changes on border security in exchange for Ukrainian aid as well. This escalation occurred despite a direct plea for aid from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who traveled to the United States in December to try and persuade GOP lawmakers to support more military funding for Ukraine by the end of 2023. Zelensky described a desperate situation in which Ukraine would run out of ammunition and be vulnerable to defeat without a quick resumption of arms shipments from the United States. However, Senate Republicans blocked the measure for increased aid for Ukraine and Israel a week later because they were unsatisfied with the border security provisions laid out in the bill. President Biden reacted to this shift by inviting negotiation with Republicans and ultimately providing significant concessions in a deal that focused on strong border security without including any of the usual protections for groups like the Dreamers, which have traditionally been demanded by Democrats. And this is where the ground then shifted for the Republicans. By allowing a deal that provided many of the items demanded by conservatives on border security, the Republicans are now faced with the decision of accepting a deal with the Biden administration on the border that could benefit the president on an issue that is one of his biggest weaknesses heading into the election. So far, Donald Trump and his congressional supporters have chosen to oppose the deal, arguing it's not strong enough and implying that a better deal could be achieved after the election. So let's talk and step back a little bit and talk briefly about each side's strategy. Why did Biden link aid to Ukraine and immigration in the first place? The move arguably made sense at the time because it solved two problems. First, President Biden is very determined to attain aid to Ukraine to avoid a victory for a victory for Russia and Vladimir Putin. Biden sees the United States' response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine as his most important foreign policy achievement. And therefore, he's willing to make significant concessions to avoid seeing Ukraine lose its fight at this critical juncture. Second, Biden needed to act to control the inflow of migrants. Over the last year, a surge of undocumented migrants entering through the southern border produced a political crisis that has hurt Biden and the Democrats substantially as they head into the 2024 campaign. I think it's important to acknowledge that we're seeing shift in public opinion in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans growing support for enhancing more border security measures. So a tipping point in this crisis came when thousands of migrants went to major cities governed by Democratic mayors, including New York City, Los Angeles, and Denver. City services, particularly housing, were quickly overwhelmed, and mayors such as New York City Mayor Eric Adams declared that they faced an emergency, and they called on President Biden to provide relief. Thus, immigration reform became a pressing and divisive issue for Biden's own party. Right? I think this is important to recognize. There's a shift in Democratic policy views here. Democrats are calling on President Biden to do more, put more pressure. And so as a result, they call for this and they're telling the president that this is becoming, inaction on this issue is going to create a significant liability for your reelection chances and our reelection chances.
Yeah, and arguably, President Biden's own position on immigration has shifted in reaction to these developments, right? And so he was much less, concentrated on border security and restricting the number of migrants, but now has, partly because all these other efforts that he's tried to find ways to solve that problem have not worked out very well. He's going on to the next potential solution.
He's moving to what was the right 6 months, 12 months ago.
Right.
So in response, the idea of striking a deal with Republicans, even on favorable terms for the other side, began to gain some currency, despite the risks of disenchanted progressives within President Biden's own Democratic Party.
Right. There was a debate within the Biden administration on this, and the stronger enforcement folks sort of started to have their sway, and because the reality shifted.
So for Republicans, linking the two issues also made strategic sense. Many conservative Republicans wanted to resist aid to Ukraine for various reasons, ranging from isolationist foreign policy preferences to avoid all foreign interventions to skepticism surrounding Ukraine's ability to actually win the war. However, they needed to avoid the charge from Democrats that their vote against Ukrainian aid would help Vladimir Putin and Russia achieve victory after an unwarranted invasion. So demanding increased border security as the price for support for Ukrainian aid provided necessary political cover for these Republicans, conservatives, what otherwise would have been an unpopular position for many Americans.
Yeah, they were in a spot in part because they had a core that pushed them, a very conservative core that wanted them to resist Ukrainian aid, and there was a lot of talking heads that were pushing this, but the broader population still had a relatively strong preference for, maintaining that aid. And so to take a stand against Ukrainian aid without having a better explanation than we're tired of this war had to be found, and this was a pretty good other explanation.
So second, then, linking these two issues provide another opportunity to highlight the border issue and blame Biden.
Yeah, which is always, effective.
Yes.
Right? And so, win-win.
In elections and in primary elections. Yes.
Right. Okay. So now we're back at the current situation. And let me just summarize here. Each side sort of stumbled into a deal that linked Ukraine aid and immigration reform together. Neither side, I would argue, really anticipated a deal that would be acceptable to either side, right? These compromises tend to just collapse and fall apart. But now there is a rather conservative plan that could appeal to a bipartisan majority because of the shifting developments surrounding border security, and because each side gets something it wants. The Democrats get aid to Ukraine, which they desperately want for a lot of reasons, electoral and international and strategic, and Republicans get stronger border security. However, the Republican side is now backing away from that deal, largely because Donald Trump's leader opposes it. And so now we want to think through that shift, right? And we want to do that here with an examination of at least a couple major Republican criticisms of the plan. And we want to look at that a little more closely. And so we're going to run a couple clips from Fox News Sunday for this segment. And so let's run the first of those clips now.
So let's talk about the rumors, give you a chance to respond to some of the critics who say they don't like what they know of this deal. There's something akin to a Title 42 power that would allow everyone at the border to be turned away once there was a rolling average over a week of 5,000 people showing up. Here's Senator Ted Cruz on that idea.
This bill normalizes 5,000 people a day coming in. 5,000 people a day is over 1.8 million a year. That's called an invasion. By the way, under Joe Biden, we've had 9.6 million. So the great Republican compromise is we're for 2/3 of Joe Biden's open borders. We'll let in 6 million instead of 9 million. This makes utterly no sense.
Is that part of the deal, and how would you convince someone like Senator Cruz to vote for it?
Yeah, the challenge that Senator Cruz has and a bunch of other folks is they're still waiting to be able to read the bill on this. And this has been our great challenge of being able to fight through the final words to be able to get the bill text out so people can hear it. Right now, there's internet rumors is all that people are running on. It would be absolutely absurd for me to agree to 5,000 people a day. This bill focuses on getting us to 0 illegal crossings a day. There's no amnesty. It increases the number of Border Patrol agents. It increases asylum officers. It increases detention beds so we can quickly detain and then deport individuals. It ends catch and release. It focuses on additional deportation flights out. It changes our asylum process so that people get a fast asylum screening at a higher standard and then get returned back to their home country. This is not about letting 5,000 people in a day. This is the most misunderstood section of this proposal. Let me tell you briefly what it is. In the last 4 months, we've had 7 days. In 4 months, we've had 7 days that we had less than 5,000 people. This is set up for If you have a rush of people coming at the border closes down, no one gets in. This is not someone standing at the border with a little clicker saying, I'm going to let one more in, we're at 4,999, and then it has to stop. It is a shutdown of the border, and everyone actually gets turned around.
Okay.
That's the focus that we have right now, is how do we actually intervene in this administration and turn people around, not let people in.
So there may be some initial measurement. You get to that rolling 5,000 in a week, and then it's zero from that point on, but there is some initial measurement. Our Bill Malugin is reporting that the number would dial back then to about 3,750 a day at the border, and then once you hit that for about 2 weeks, the gates would open again. Can you confirm or deny that?
Yeah, it's not, again, it's not gates opening. That's a misunderstanding of the bill itself. It's how many can we process and actually deport. When you raise the standard for people coming across, when you increase the detention beds, when you increase deportation flights, you're not letting people in. And people are thinking about how the Biden administration is running it now. Right now, the Biden administration is allowing, for instance, 1,500 people a day just to come to the ports of entry, get a work permit, and get released in the country. People coming between ports of entry get what's called a notice to appear and get released in the country. All of that stops. We're focused on how many people can we process quickly and then deport out of the country, not release into the country. It would be absolutely absurd for anyone to be able to propose something to say we're just going to slow the number of releases. We're focused on how do we actually enforce our border and get us back to zero people actually crossing the border illegally. Every administration has struggled to be able to get the authorities in place to be able to actually enforce our border. Let's put them in place.
All right, let me try to cover a few things here. First, there are a number of specific complaints from Republican critics that can all be categorized, in my opinion, as a general suspicion that Republican negotiators have conceded too much on this deal. And basically, one of the central substantive critiques of the deal from Republicans is that conservatives simply find it hard to believe that a deal hammered out with Democrats could ever limit illegal border crossings to the extent that Republicans and conservatives demand. Now, one might concede that such a suspicion is warranted from conservatives due to the starkly different policy positions on border security usually pursued by Democrats and the prior stated positions on immigration that were held by President Biden, who's never really endorsed any of these really dramatic border security measures. However, let me also say that in its extreme form, this kind of approach, this sort of level of suspicion that there's no deal that could have come out of this negotiation that we would be happy with, also means that no deal between Republicans and the Biden administration would have been acceptable to the rank and file of the Republican Party. And then consequently, that also means that the Republican demand for greater border security from the Biden administration in exchange for support for Ukrainian aid was never a genuine proposal. So, given these two possibilities, legitimate skepticism of what's in the deal, but also, the idea of using that skepticism to just reject any and all outcomes, it's important to carefully consider the merits of the criticisms that are currently getting lodged against this deal on the airwaves. And so one example of this is what we just saw in this clip, the debate over the emergency shutdown provision. In the clip, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas has seized and focused on the 5,000 person threshold that mandates a shutdown as evidence that the law is not strong enough, claiming that such a rule would simply allow up to that limit, 5,000, to enter the United States on a daily basis. And then he calculates that out, 365 times 5,000, and you're letting in nearly 2 million new entrants into the United States every year. If that's accurate, and and the way that the policy works, then that's a powerful critique. However, Senator Lankford, who negotiated the deal, argues that this depiction is not accurate. Lankford claims that the deal provides numerous tools, not just the emergency shutdown authority, but also changes to a range of asylum rules that he lays out, and we've talked about already, to significantly limit illegal border crossings at much lower than the 5,000 per day rate that Cruz cites as his central critique here, right? According to Lankford, the emergency shutdown power is instead an extraordinary action that is taken when the border is overwhelmed and can't process a huge influx of migrants. The 5,000 threshold is presented then as the definition of such an emergency situation. And when that happens, then it triggers a shutdown of the border, and that shutdown then turns away all migrants at the border. So ultimately, Lankford argues that the deal is stronger than the critics allow, even critics from within his own party, not only because it provides the president new emergency powers to shut down the border temporarily when U.S. authorities are overwhelmed by these large inflows, but because it creates a range of policy instruments that offer immediate relief and is better than any previous deal that Republicans have had a chance to accept in years. So no clickers, no clickers. But now let's look at the other major factor for Republican opposition to this plan: presidential electoral politics and Donald Trump's opposition. So we're going to run our second clip from Fox News Sunday. Let's go ahead and roll that now.
President Biden spoke about this last night on a campaign rally, and he said essentially if the bill were law today, it would shut down the border right now and fix this whole thing. So a lot of Republicans are saying he has things he could use now, executive powers and laws that are not being enforced. So why give him this in an election year, the cover of this deal that, critics say is still going to let a lot of people in, but he gets to take a victory lap that he's gotten something done?
Yeah, well, it's definitely not going to let a bunch of people in. It's focused on actually turning people around on it. It is interesting. Republicans 4 months ago would not give funding for Ukraine, for Israel, and for our southern border because we demanded changes in policy. So we actually locked arms together and said, we're not going to give you money for this. We want a change in law. And now it's interesting, a few months later, when we're finally getting to the end, they're like, oh, just kidding. I actually don't want a change in law because it's a presidential election year. We all have an oath to the Constitution, and we have a commitment to say we're going to do whatever we can to be able to secure the border. Just as a quick, for instance, the last 4 months, we've had 50 people cross our border on the terror watch list. 50. We've had tens of thousands of people that were declared by this administration a national security risk that came across our border and were released. It is our constitutional obligation to be able to secure our country as fast as we can secure our country. This puts in mandatory pieces that haven't been there in the past to make this administration actually enforce the law. I would tell you that I don't know of anyone that believes that if President Trump was elected, well, he was president right now, this border would not have this problem. So the thought that somehow President Biden can suddenly be the pro-national security president in the final months of this is not believable. We've had millions of people illegally cross because he opened up our border. He literally invited the world to be able to come, and they came. That's why we have this chaos. We've got to do something now to be able to stop it, and then to be able to put new tools that even the Trump administration was looking for when they were president, put those tools in place for every president from here on out.
So let's work through some of the layers to the electoral reasons for Republican opposition to this potential plan. First and foremost, Republicans want to continue to use immigration as an issue against Biden and Democrats in the current electoral campaign. They can't do that as effectively if they agree to a deal on border security brokered by President Biden that includes many of the provisions they have long demanded. And so, from the perspective of short-term electoral strategy, this criticism rings true. If the deal passes, Biden can take credit for it, and good reason. Second, there are some splits within the Republican Party that have probably kept this deal on life support even after Donald Trump came out against it. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has done the most to try and kill the deal by declaring that it's, quote, dead on arrival in the House. It's likely that he will not bring it up for a vote if it passes the Senate. This is because he is closer ideologically to Trump and far-right conservatives within the House who want to kill it. However, the Senate's a slightly different story. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McDonald has been a consistent proponent of aid to Ukraine, and Republican Senator James Lankford worked or led the negotiations for Republicans on the deal and has defended it in public. Lankford is doing the negotiations with the support of McConnell. Right? So before Trump declared his opposition, there was a reasonable chance that a relatively significant share of Republican senators might support the deal.
Yeah.
Finally, given that the deal would need to pass both the House and the Senate, some Republican senators have publicly argued that the Senate should abandon the project altogether. Yeah. Whether they support or oppose the measure, they don't want to take a tough vote if the law has no chance to pass in the House. And one final point. As we've seen throughout this discussion, the idea that Donald Trump and Republicans are driven primarily by electoral incentives to deny President Biden a win has been asserted regularly by commentators. However, it's voiced by Republican critics and is framed as an indictment that Donald Trump and his congressional supporters are acting cynically by walking away from a deal they would normally support if there wasn't an approaching election. What's interesting about this Fox News clip is that the electoral motive is not treated as a critique of Republicans by the journalists questioning James Lankford. Instead, it's a sincere question. Why is he, a Republican, defending a plan that could help the other side in the next election? Lankford's answer is important as well. He reminds the audience that Republicans demanded changes in policy on border security if they were going to support aid for Ukraine. He suggests that turning their backs on the deal before even seeing the final text would mean they were negotiating in bad faith. More importantly, he argues that all elected officials, including Republicans, have a constitutional obligation to safeguard the border. From his perspective, this means considering the deal without letting electoral strategy enter in the calculation. And the other thing to keep in mind all about this is the proposal would give Republicans what they said they wanted in these negotiations all along.
And the one thing we should sort of touch on here is you could, there's an argument out there, right? Like, if it's not going to pass anyway, why force senators, Republican senators, to vote on this and take a tough stand that they could get punished on either side and will, right? Just to see it die in the House. I mean, I get that argument. But the broader question is what intrigues me here is that, look, the idea, at least in my opinion, that, well, this is a bad bill for conservatives and Republicans, and let's not engage with it and wait till the election, we'll win, and then we'll be able to get a much stronger, better, holistic border security bill. I think that's unrealistic. The idea that they're going to get another shot at this from just the conservative Republican perspective, that's going to have an option that has this much border security and no other elements to it, just I don't see as very plausible.
Can I add two other reasons that there might be risks to House Republicans for not signing on this, which are puzzling to me in terms of their saying right now, we're not going to touch this. First is that assumes that they wouldn't be punished at the ballot box in November for the failure to get a deal. So imagine there isn't a deal, and now President Biden and the Democrats say, we gave you everything you wanted back in January and February, and you said no. And now border crossings go up in the summer months, and now instead of having an issue that they can criticize the Democrats for, now the Democrats say, you wouldn't give us the tools to solve this problem. It's your fault. Now they own the policy failures that potentially come afterwards. So that's one thing.
No, I would just say that they understand.
They share in the costs.
Plus, all of this is going to be viewed through a partisan lens, and even the news on this will be received through a partisan lens, and that's partly why we used Fox News clips here to provide a range, because when I was looking for clips, all of them were really this like, well, it's so cynical. They're just using backing out of this deal because of an approaching election. It was sort of interesting to see a different way, like why would we do this, right? And so, there is the chance that they could do that, and very few people are going to look at this issue that way. Instead, the base of the Republican Party is like, thank goodness we avoided a terrible bill. That was a terrible bill. And they just accept that. And then they will continue to blame Biden, and any attempt by Biden to say, this isn't my fault. We had a deal. They just rejected it for electoral gain is going to not register. There's a slim part of the electorate that will be open to that persuasion.
That's where I was going to go.
Right? And whether, that's a pretty uncertain calculation how large that portion is. Are they in the battleground states that will determine the election? I mean, all of this gets sliced pretty thin.
Well, but so there's two aspects of this. So this is a good point. Republicans aren't going to punish. Diehard Republicans aren't going to punish. But partly then, so let's adjust and say, well, Johnson is then assuming that independents won't punish.
Right.
And that's more debatable. And the thing to remember here too is it's not just a story about the presidential election, it's also about swing districts in the House, right? And so if he's going to assume that the Republicans aren't going to pay costs for this, if border security worsens over the summer by opposing this deal, there's also an argument to be made, well, this could cost them swing districts, and this could actually undermine the Republican majority in the House. Okay, so the point is that there are electoral risks associated with the Republicans for saying we don't want a deal now after it looks like they got some significant concessions.
But can we concede that there are electoral risks for Republicans in accepting this deal too?
Yes.
I think they're not wrong.
Yes.
That this is not a deal that will help them in the 2024 election. Yeah. They're right that it probably will, on the margins, hurt them. There's not going to be diehard Republicans that will change their vote toward Democrats because of this deal, but the whole issue of immigration and border security that has been working very well for Republicans could dramatically change if this deal was. And that's why they don't want it to go through. Right. And then if you compare that to the risks of rejecting the deal and getting punished, I think they'd still say, we're going to get punished a lot more by accepting the deal than rejecting it. That's my point.
Yeah, and the question, and let's go back and think about moderates, the center-right members. Where's the punishment going to come from? It's going to come from President Trump, right? And it'll come from pressure for getting primaried on the right in the next election. Mm-hmm. Let me add one more thing. So this is all electoral things. The other risks here that Republicans, and this is both Johnson and Trump faces. Let's imagine that the Republicans sweep in 2024. They win the House, they have a majority in the Senate, and President Trump wins. Mm-hmm. Now to get a border deal, we still have that old Senate, 60 votes in the Senate. They got to get over the filibuster. And the question is, did the Democrats make the same concessions when they are the minority party within each of those three branches? And so there, under those conditions, you could not be able to get any deal at all because the Democrats say, now we're going to punish you for what you did last spring. Mm-hmm. So there's that risk as well.
Right. And now the other big risk that I want to point out, you've got a list of risks. Some of them are electoral on the slide. Some of them are broader. I'd say we can't forget the substantive risks here, and there's two, right? The biggest risk is that Russia and Vladimir Putin could win the war in Ukraine for no reason but the United States couldn't navigate its domestic politics to continue to provide support, military support for Ukraine to keep it armed to defend itself. And, if that then starts a chain reaction that changes the international order and threatens other European countries and emboldens China against Taiwan, that is a huge cost.
Can we just play out the logic a little bit there of the mechanisms by which this might happen? So imagine military aid from the U.S. to Ukraine dries up. Right. Now, it's not only that Ukraine doesn't have U.S. military aid, now Europe starts saying, well, if we don't have U.S. military aid that's going to Ukraine, will our military aid make a difference? Or should we then not spend as well? And so it's not just, it's the kinetic effects of U.S. aid that the failure to solve domestic politics in the U.S. then leads to a collapse of all aid for Ukraine, which speeds up its risks of getting defeated by Russia, right? And so it creates a broader fraying of the coalition of the West. Yeah.
And the thing to note, and it's on that slide too, is this: there is a backup plan for those who support continuing aid to Ukraine, for Democrats, but also for especially Senate Republicans who are invested in this, Mitch McConnell, but also others, and that is to then shift to a what they call a clean bill on just Ukrainian aid that could potentially get enough Republican votes plus all the Democratic votes to pass both houses of Congress and kind of save that part of it. Whether that would actually get through, I mean, it should have gotten through a long time ago if it was going to get through. But now, I think with all the cards on the table, and you know, if this deal that linked border security with Ukraine aid falls apart, I do think that there will be one final push to try to just at least do a clean bill. We'll see.
Can I ask you, do you think that gets through the House, though? Or
well,
how do you envision getting that through the House?
Well,
because
you know, they just need a few Republicans to, you know, they don't need very many because there's, you know, they get all the Democrats, right? And so you just need, you know, a handful, you know, less than 10 to get, you need it to, the biggest challenge would be, would Johnson actually put it up for a vote?
That's what I was going to say.
And yeah, that will be the biggest obstacle. So, yeah, and then the only other big risk here we've already talked to, there are some electoral risks for Biden here. I mean, on both sides, right? If it falls apart, you know, he might still get blamed for chaos at the border from independents and swing voters and the like, just because he's the president, right? And it's not clear to me that a critical mass is going to say no, he tried and it's the other side's fault. You know, there's a lot of history here that would suggest that no, there's a lot of fault to go around. But he also has to think about the progressive part of his own party sort of correctly holding him accountable for selling out a position that he originally declared at the beginning of his term. Yeah. You know, and that's a huge risk.
Yeah, there are risks to deeper fraying in the Democratic coalition if Biden gets this, because this is going to make progressive members, particularly in the House, vulnerable to their voters. Their voters are going to be frustrated with this, and that could also then cost Democrats votes in the House and in the presidential race in the fall.
Yeah. So, a lot of risks.
Yes, and it is. Yes, this is politically. This is a treacherous path for the negotiators in the process. They are spending lots of political capital here.
Yes.
You can see I don't think we mentioned the Republican Party in Oklahoma over the weekend censured Lankford for his negotiation efforts. They called him out.
I'll admit I'm kind of a fan. Yeah. You know, that was a gutsy set of moves he did. Yeah. You know, and he's on an island.
Yes, he's on an island. So anyway, I'm sure we're going to come back to this. Stay tuned. We should have some sense, maybe not in the next news segment, but maybe the one after that, about what's all going to happen here, whether this process is going to die or we're going to see some type of legislative deal.
And one last thing. Military aid to Israel is also being held up by all this. And we don't, we didn't talk about it this time because we've talked a lot about these, but that's also a problem.
So, all right, we'll see you in the next segment.